Matt Jameson was one of those people who was constantly looking for thrills. A set of boring and monotonous cases made no sense to him. After graduating from college, he settled in a small town to take up work in IT, and at the same time take a break from the adventures he had been looking for all his life. He thought that living in a quiet neighborhood would allow him to relax, but boredom began to overwhelm him. One day, while casually watching the news, Matt came across an old article about an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. The article said that something terrible happened in this house many years ago, and it has been empty ever since. People said that experiments were once carried out in the house, which led to unexplained consequences. Although there wasn't much information, the article immediately caught Matt's attention. Inspired by his old hobbies, he decided to explore this place. Matt found some old photographs taken before the house was closed and discovered that the building had once belonged to a private laboratory. There were rumors that the laboratory was conducting experimental research in the field of psychology and neuroscience, which caused mass protests and finally led to the closure of the institution. The programs were too radical, and as a result, many people were involved in cruel experiments. Matt was amazed at how vague and sinister the history of this house was. Having prepared properly, he decided to explore the abandoned building. He bought the necessary equipment: flashlight, cameras, several tools for opening locks, and of course, protective clothing. He wanted to make sure that his adventure would not be his last. The preparation was thorough, but still he did not expect how dark and scary the real atmosphere of the abandoned house would be. When Matt first crossed the threshold of this building, he felt that something was wrong. He knew that the house was empty, but the feeling of an ominous presence in the air was strong. There was an inevitability in every step that he would soon face something he couldn't control. The ground floor of the house was in complete disrepair. Dusty windows, broken floors, and dilapidated walls left no doubt that the building had not been used for many years. However, when Matt began to explore, he discovered that there were several closed doors on this floor, which clearly led to more secure, closed areas. He noticed that one of the doors had recently modified locking mechanisms, which indicated that someone might have tried to enter here after the laboratory was closed. Matt decided that this place could hold key clues about what happened. With the help of his tools, he was able to open one of these doors and found himself in a small corridor led to the old laboratory. The laboratory had a lot of antique equipment and chemical reagents that had long lost their relevance.
But the most shocking discovery was that there were notes and graphs on the walls that clearly dealt with human trial. Matt came across an extensive archive of medical records and scientific reports containing details of the gruesome research. The experiments conducted here were aimed at exploring the limits of the human mind and controlling behavior. The documents described how scientists tried to inject various psychotropic substances and neurostimulators into the brains of subjects in order to change their behavior and perception of reality. Some of the recordings contained eerie details about how the participants in the experiments lost the ability to distinguish reality from fiction. Their mental state rapidly deteriorated, which led to aggressive behavior and even suicide. Matt was shocked by these discoveries and began to realize that the house he was exploring was a place of real human suffering. As he continued his research, he noticed that the building was starting to change. Some of the doors he had already explored were now locked, and the paths he had just passed through were blocked. New inscriptions and warnings began to appear on the walls, as if someone was trying to report the real dangers hidden in this place. Matt found an antique safe in one of the rooms, which turned out to be filled with notes and personal diaries of laboratory staff. These recordings contain details about how the scientists were trying to deal with the consequences of their own experiments. One of the most shocking moments was the diary of one of the scientists, who described how he and his colleagues began to lose control of the systems they created. This led to the fact that many participants in the experiments began to feel part of an ominous mechanism that they could not stop. Based on these recordings, Matt realized that the laboratory had created a system that maintained a state of insanity among the subjects, and was probably part of this system itself. Trying to find a way out, he began to encounter new, even more complex mechanisms and traps that were part of the system of protection against unauthorized access. Each attempt to find a way out only deepened his sense of panic. The sounds and noises in the corridors seemed more and more ominous, and Matt began to feel that he was being followed. He discovered that even the walls of the house had their own defense mechanism that changed their location and created mazes. Delay him. Eventually, Matt found a room that was covered with notes and graphs showing how the system was structured. In these recordings, he found instructions for disabling some mechanisms. He realized that to do this, he needed to connect several wires and activate certain levers. However, when he tried to follow these instructions, the system began to react even more aggressively. The rooms began to change again. The traps activated, and the walls began to move, blocking his path. Matt felt like he was falling into a trap, and every move he made only made his situation worse. Matt, fighting a growing sense of panic, continued to explore the changing space of the house. His every move was like walking through a minefield. Each new discovery only added to the tension. Despite his efforts, he felt that the house system was becoming more aggressive and inflexible. When he tried to use the instructions to disable the mechanisms again, the system responded unexpectedly. He heard an ominous crack, and the walls began to move faster than ever. Traps and barriers that were previously hidden have now become active, creating a new series of obstacles. One of the most gruesome finds he made was a room filled with creepy installations consisting of translucent tubes and wires connected to devices seemed to be part of a control system for the subjects. There were dark liquids inside the tubes, which he realized could be the results of experimental procedures. One of the tubes was damaged, and a dark substance began to leak out, filling the floor of the room. Matt knew that if he didn't stop this process, the liquid could flood the whole house, which would lead to even more problems. He rushed to find a way to stop the leak and discovered that one of the shut-off control systems was an old pump. Quickly examined the pump and realized that it had to be activated manually. While he was trying to control the pump, he heard strange noises from the darkness. He noticed that the shadows around him began to move more actively, and with each passing second, it became more difficult to understand where they were and where the real objects were. Suddenly, in one of the dark recesses, he noticed something strange: tangled wires, which, apparently, were part of a more complex system. Matt understood that his only chance of survival was to turn off the control system and find a way out. But each attempt to do this was accompanied by more and more difficulties. The rooms became endlessly confusing, and he noticed that even the simplest actions could now lead to unpredictable results. At some point, he discovered that the doors and windows that he had once opened were now gone, and new barriers had appeared in their place. Despite this, Matt found ancient circuits in one of the rooms that helped him figure out how to disable part of the system. He found several key nodes that needed to be deactivated in order to stop some protection function. This was dangerous and required great care, as any mistake could lead to even more chaos. While he was working on deactivating the system, he noticed that one of the devices he thought was inactive started working. A scan appeared on the screen showing his current position in the house. He saw that something unknown was following him. It moved as if it was trying to anticipate his actions and block his path. Matt was getting more tired and annoyed with each step, but he knew that if he didn't complete his task, he wouldn't be able to get out of this nightmare. Concentrated on the last step of the instructions, activating the emergency switch was supposed to turn off all other mechanisms. It required pressing several buttons at the same time, and Matt knew that any delay could cost him his life. When he finally activated the switch, he felt the system start to shut down. At first, it was a minor change, but soon the room began to recover, and many of the barriers disappeared. The defense system seemed to become less active, and Matt, using his last strength, headed for the exit, which seemed to have become accessible After activating the emergency switch, Matt felt some relief, but his work was not finished yet. Although many of the mechanisms and traps had stopped working, he was still in a maze that was changing and filled with dangers. Realizing that his time was running out, he continued to move towards the exit, hoping that he would be able to get out until the system activated new traps. Matt reached a hallway that didn't seem to have changed. This was one of the paths he had taken before. He remembered that there were several doors in this corridor, and although most of them had been blocked or changed, he noticed one that was now open. He decided to check it out, hoping that it would lead to an exit, or at least to a less dangerous part of the building. He found another laboratory room behind the door, but it was different. There was no antique equipment or medical instruments here. Instead, he saw modern computers and high-tech equipment that looked like they had been recently installed. This place was clearly not completely abandoned yet, and he noticed that current research and reports were open on the computer screens. Matt went to one of the computers and noticed that the system was active. He started going through the files and found the latest reports on laboratory experiments that were still being conducted here. The records showed that research was continuing and new experiments were still being carried out, despite previous problems. Searching for information in the files revealed details that developments in the field of manipulation of human behavior continued in this place, which shocked him to the core. Matt noticed that the data on the screen also contained information about plans to upgrade the security system. These plans showed that new devices had been installed to provide even stricter controls, and he realized that these changes could explain many of the problems he was facing. He also saw indications that someone else was working in the lab, and this increased his anxiety. While trying to use computers to find a clearer way out, Matt noticed that the lighting control system was active. He decided to check the control panels to see how they were connected to the rest of the building. He found that lighting control could also control other aspects of the system, such as ventilation and control over certain parts of the laboratory. When trying to change the settings, he noticed that some unknown parameters began to change, and new noises and vibrations began in the building. This indicated that the system had activated new protective measures. It was a reminder that the building continued to change in response to his actions. When he looked through the reports, he found documents that confirmed that the new experiments were aimed at creating autonomous systems capable of making decisions and acting without human intervention. These systems used advanced artificial intelligence technology that could control all aspects of the building and possibly even control the operation of experiments. Matt realized that he was not alone in this building. Someone or something else is using these systems to monitor him. Knowing that autonomous systems could monitor his every move only increased his fear. He felt that his every move could be predicted and traps could be triggered. He made the wrong choice. In search of a safe exit, he headed for the main control panel, which he hoped could allow him to monitor the operation of the systems and possibly turn them off completely. As he approached the panel, he noticed that the air in the room had become unusually cold, and he felt that the presence of other people or systems had become even more noticeable. He started working on the panel, using all the knowledge he had accumulated during his time in the laboratory. It was a difficult task that required fine-tuning, and Matt was aware that any mistake could lead to even more serious consequences. With each successful action, he watched as the systems began to shut down, but it also attracted the attention of the autonomous defense mechanisms, which became more active. Matt, already exhausted and on the verge of a nervous breakdown, continued to work on the control panel. He was aware that every second mattered. Security systems that had seemed surmountable to him until recently now began to actively respond to his actions. Everything around him was vibrating, making loud noises, and he felt as if the building was coming to life, trying to stop him. He managed to partially shut down the systems, but he knew that this was a temporary solution. With each push of a button or movement of a lever, he felt that he was making his task more difficult. One of the control panels began to crack, and sparks began to fly out of it, reminding that everything could get out of control at any moment. Just as Matt was about to complete his manipulations, he heard a growing noise that seemed to be approaching him. The walls began to move, and he noticed that some of the doors that had previously been open were now closing, as if creating even more obstacles. His every action could have been predicted by systems that became even more aggressive. Suddenly, he saw a strong light appear at the end of the corridor, which seemed to show the way to the exit. It was the only way out that seemed to be still available. Matt hurried to him, overcoming the last obstacle. He knew it could be a trap, but he had no other choice. When he reached the exit, he saw a closed door in front of him, protected by the latest level of security system. Matt used his last strength to open the door, and finally managed to get out. He found himself in a small room that led to the street. With relief, he ran outside and felt the fresh air. He turned around and saw the building he had just left begin to collapse. Internal mechanisms and systems began to work uncontrollably, creating explosions and crackling. It seemed that the house was self-destructing in order to hide its secrets forever. Matt couldn't believe he'd survived. His face was covered in dirt and blood, and he could feel the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He was able to get to the nearest place where he received medical care and where he could rest. When he regained consciousness, he found that all his equipment, notes, and all records of the incident had been lost. All he has left are vivid, frightening memories and a feeling of deep shock from what he has been through. He tried to talk about his experiences, but many of the details seemed too absurd or unrealistic for those who listened to him. After examining the traces left by that house, investigators found it completely destroyed and abandoned, but could not find any evidence that experiments had ever been carried out in it. All records and equipment were destroyed. The case was closed, and the story of the house and its horrors remained unknown to most people. Matt, however, knew the truth. He understood that his life and the lives of others were at risk in this terrible place. He could never find peace again, and the memories of what had happened haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw creepy images and felt fear, as if he was inside that nightmare again.